Alright, so a lot of you guys have been asking about architecture, and I've been interested in learning more about architecture, just like apparently many of you. So we're going to start this series of talking about buildings, talking about different architectural styles. And to do that, we're going to be using a lot of the buildings here at the University of Michigan. So this is the U of M Law School, and obviously this first week we're going to be talking about Gothic architecture. And I'm standing on the law quad here. This complex of buildings was designed by a New York-based architectural firm called York & Sawyer. And there's actually 4 buildings here that were built in the 1920s and the 1930s. So we're just going to kind of walk around, and I'm just going to talk. It's not really going to be that formal. But the style you're seeing here is, obviously this is not original Gothic in its original sense, right? Which was, original Gothic buildings like the big cathedrals in Europe. Those were built in the Middle Ages, and this was built in the 20th century. So this is what we call Neo-Gothic or Gothic Revival. And we can actually be more specific. This is English Gothic Revival. So Gothic architecture is just sort of a generic term for what's really a lot of different architectural styles that were localized to different countries. So we have English Gothic, French Gothic, Italian Gothic. And we'll talk a little bit more in detail about what it means to be English Gothic as opposed to some of these other styles. But what's interesting about these buildings is that although they all are English Gothic, they're not consistent with a particular century. So Gothic architecture, even within a single country, changed over time. And what we're seeing here is actually a lot of different styles of English Gothic architecture as they evolved over time in this single quad, the single complex of buildings. And that was actually something that's very true of actual, real middle-age Gothic buildings as well, is that a lot of times they reflect a multitude of different Gothic styles. Because these giant cathedrals in Europe, they took centuries to build, and what was popular in terms of Gothic architecture would change over time. So what you can do is you can actually date different parts of cathedrals based on their architectural style, because you can determine what was popular at the time, and from that you can then figure out when this particular part of the cathedral was being built. So this was something that York & Sawyer, the architects, did on purpose. They said that they wanted a sentimental connection between legal education at Michigan and then this rich legal and academic past. So the collection of varied English Gothic styles is supposed to reflect this progression of law throughout the centuries, I guess, which is connected by this common theme of justice, I suppose we could say, is kind of the common uniting theme of law. And in that same sense, the architecture of the building, although it reflects a lot of different English styles, is united by the fact that it's all Gothic and it all contains the same building materials: granite, limestone, and then, of course, the slate roofing. So this building that we're outside of right now was the first building to be built in the law school. This was built in 1925, and it's called the Lawyers Club, which I guess, I think it has kind of lounges and maybe some student housing in it. And this part of the law school, even though it was the first part to be built, is actually the most recent in terms of the type of English Gothic style that's employed here. So this is the characteristic of the later Tudor style. So this is late 16th century English Gothic. And a lot of Italian and Flemish influences show up here that aren't characteristic of traditional Gothic architecture. And I can see a great example right here, for instance. This bay window. So bay windows are not really Gothic here, and this would have been an influence of the Renaissance. And that's something that's really characteristic of a lot of later Gothic architectures, that it's influenced by Renaissance architecture. So you can see some of the tracery up there above the windows. That's what dates this as later Gothic, more flamboyant in style. Apparently there's some construction going on here. Oh, this is interesting. Okay, so this is a great example of another great example of how Renaissance architecture influences Gothic architecture. We're walking on this portico, I don't know what you'd call this, kind of like an arcade. See these columns here? Definitely not something that we traditionally associate with Gothic architecture. This is much more characteristic of the Renaissance. And what's particularly interesting, actually, about the way that they've incorporated this, thinking about it, is that the architectural styles here progress in order. So this, which I think is the dining hall for the Lawyers Club, is the style here is a lot older. So this is early Tudor. Sometimes this is what's called like the perpendicular style, which we'll talk a little bit more about in just a minute. But then moving over on here to the back side of the Lawyers Club, this is Renaissance Gothic. So it's got the arcaded columns. So this looks kind of like something we would see maybe in like an ancient Roman building or something. And then the cook dormitories, which are over here, are characteristic of an even later Gothic style. So this is what I would probably call late Tudor or Jacobean. So we're going to start over here. We're going to go from oldest to most recent in terms of the style, not in terms of when the building was built. So this is what we call decorated English Gothic. Okay, this is what we call perpendicular, or this is early Tudor. Renaissance Gothic. And then this is late Tudor or Jacobean. Okay? Now we're going to talk more about what each of those terms mean in just a minute, but I want to give you a sense of what we're going to be talking about before we begin here. Okay, so I'm just going to do a voiceover on this part because the audio from the video was a bit of a mess. But we've jumped over to the front end of the legal research building here in the law library, and this is the good example of the decorated English Gothic style. So this is late 14th century. We see some elements of early 15th century style English Gothic here as well. The decorated style is the earliest style that we see represented here. It came before the perpendicular style. And because it came earlier, I would say it's a little bit maybe more true to Gothic architecture's roots. So it's a little bit more geometrically interesting. You can see characterized by the heavy tracery here, the big towers and the large pointed arch windows, as well as some of the more elaborate touches, the parapets and the trefoils in the windows that give this style its name, decorated. There's also some pretty heavy buttressing that you can see along the side of the building here. So let's move back over now to the Lawyers Club, and we'll look at the perpendicular style, which came a little bit later. So I said, like this, the dining hall here is early Tudor. Is usually, I guess the more common term here is perpendicular style. So there's an emphasis on vertical straight lines. So you can see from like the buttresses here how they kind of form perpendicular lines in the building that end in the parapets up there. And supposedly this this perpendicular style, its simplicity, was something that was inspired by the plague, the Black Death. Supposedly architects were emotionally influenced by that it was such a devastating time in England that the architecture that's characteristic of that period is much simpler, much less flamboyant than some of the later Gothic styles. But the cook dormitory, which is what we're walking by now, is this is a later style, so this would be like late Tudor or Jacobean is sometimes what this is called. So I've already talked about there's a much more of an emphasis on an incorporation of Renaissance techniques here, like the arches that we see in the arcade, the bay windows, and in general it's just a little bit more flamboyant. So here's a good example. See the scrolls there underneath the bay window? Let me zoom in a little bit. Okay, the scrolls over there. The shapes of the windows are rounded, not pointed. So usually when we think of Gothic architecture, we think of the pointed arches. Like what we see over here, this is the Legal Research Library. The style of windows there, it's sometimes called the Tudor arch. This is characteristic of a much later style. So this is more Renaissance. More curves, more columns, more arches. And I've been thrown around the term Tudor a lot. So Tudor architecture, which is not an exact parallel with the actual House of Tudor, is characterized by, it's a Gothic style, so it's characterized by really steep roofs, which you can't really appreciate from this angle. Well, maybe up here we can. Steep roofs, and also really big chimneys. Oh, and here's a perfect example of that right here. Zoom up there. Big chimneys. So that's the telltale sign of the Tudor style. You can see the big chimneys right here. And these chimney pots supposedly were kind of supposed to emphasize the new technology of the day. So in earlier Gothic architecture, fireplaces, that wasn't something that you could include on a second floor of the house. So apparently in the Tudor period of English Gothic architecture, they would put these big chimneys on tops of these Gothic buildings to emphasize the fact that there were fireplaces on the second floor. And I'm not exactly sure why, like how you can connect the fact that there's bigger chimneys to the fact that there's a fireplace on an upper floor. But apparently that's what those are supposed to represent. And look at some of the styles of the doorways here. So that's kind of a pointed arch type design. Stained glass here, okay, a little bit more flamboyant. And another characteristic of the Tudor Gothic style is that they would have these big gables, like we see here. And that was to emphasize the fact that the second floor ran the entire length of the building. So that was something else that was kind of a newer innovation, was that they would have these second floors that covered the entire building, which in earlier Gothic architecture, that wasn't the case. They would just build a single floor with, extremely high vaulted ceilings. So the fact that they were adding additional floors, that was something that they wanted to emphasize, so they used these big gables, like we see up here. So the cook dormitory, I don't know if I already mentioned this, this was built a little later, so this is built in the 1930s. And the style is also much more recent than some of the other parts of the law school here. So once again, we're seeing Renaissance themes show up here. So the Doric style columns, or I'm sorry, not Doric. These are Ionic. The Ionic columns on the periphery of the doorway here. So I was thinking a little bit more about the chimney issue that I brought up before. And the chimney to us seems like pretty primitive technology, but back in the early Middle Ages, most buildings, from the smallest houses up into the big royal castles, they would just have a big central hearth, a big fire pit on the ground floor, and then they would cut a hole in the roof to vent out the smoke, which meant they couldn't really have an upper floor that ran the full length of the house, and even if they did, they had no way of heating it because it was too dangerous to put one of these hearths on the second floor when the floor was just made of flammable wood. So owners who had adopted this new technology of the chimney wanted to emphasize that. So that's why these big chimney pots, they're very decorative, became so popular during this time period. Alright guys, that pretty much wraps up our architectural tour of the University of Michigan Law School. Be sure to check it out if you're ever in Ann Arbor, and congratulations if you made it to the end of this video. And as always, I hope to see you back here again real soon. Until then.